So the history of London could easily be described as the history of fire. There were so many fires in London down through the centuries that only the most notable were ever recorded. And the event that was recorded more than any, with countless reports from the government, from newspapers, contemporary reports, was the Great Fire of London. And two commentaries rise above all the others. And these are the diaries of two great 17th century Londoners. They were John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys, and their diaries described the fire in such detail from the scene of the action that you can practically smell the smoke coming from the pages of their diaries 350 years later. So London was at the time the biggest city in Britain by a long way. It had 300,000 residents and 80,000 citizens living within the city walls. And the city was an immense warren of overcrowded, narrow streets, lined with buildings much like this one, made of combustible material like timber and wattle and daub, and even thatched roofs still. And even their design was a problem. Look at the narrow floors at the bottom, and then they get wider and wider towards the top, so you can almost shake hands with your neighbour if you was in the upstairs floors. And London was very dry at the time. It had a drought in place since 1665, November, right up till September. And they had a very hot summer. So all these materials like timber and wattle and daub were very, very dry, almost like they were half burned already. And you combine this with the fact that in the warehouses all along the river, they were full of coal, timber, oil, wax, tallow, spirits, gunpowder, paper, everything that would be flammable for some reason was stored inside the city walls. So the question isn't so much how did a major European city burn down for the first time since the Roman Empire, but how did it not happen sooner? So the fire started in Pudding Lane at the bakery of Thomas Faryner. This is Pudding Lane just here, north of London Bridge. And the bakery might have looked something like this. And this is a computer representation, of course. And the fire was discovered just after 1 a.m. on the 2nd of September, which was a Sunday, by one of the workers, possibly Thomas Faryner's son. And he discovered the fire on the ground floor and immediately woke up the residents of the house, and they all clambered out of an upstairs window, all except one person, the maid. For some reason, she wouldn't go out of the window, stayed in the bakery and burned to death, becoming the first victim of the Great Fire of London. The neighbours saw the fire and tried to put it out before it took light in the rest of the buildings in the street. So they called the night watchmen and the constables, who would have more experience of fires, because there was, of course, no fire brigade in those days. It was down to public-spirited citizens. And these are some of the equipment they would have used. Fire squirts. To give you an idea of the size of this would have taken 3 people to lift it up and to use it. It's like a massive syringe. And the buckets they had were leather buckets lined with pitch. But the experienced firemen, if we can call them that, would have realised that in order to stop the fire, you have to pull down buildings with these long fire hooks. But they didn't have the authority to do this. Only one man had the authority to do that, and that was the Lord Mayor, and that was Sir Thomas Bloodworth. So he was grabbed from his bed and taken to the scene of the fire, and he uttered the immortal words, "Pish, a woman might piss it out," before grumpily returning to bed. Just down the road in Seething Lane, about 5 streets to the east, another man was still in his bed, and that was the famous diarist Samuel Pepys. He was woken up around about 2 o'clock by his maids, who said, "Look, there's a fire down the road. What are we going to do?" He looked out the window and said, "It's far enough away not to be a problem." So he goes back to bed, but wakes up in the morning and sees that the fire has really taken hold. It's gone down to the wharves and the warehouses full of all those combustible material, but it's also got as far as London Bridge. Pepys could see people frantically moving their goods from one house to the next. That one would catch fire, then move it to the next one. 4 or 5 times they'd be doing this. Even the pigeons were reluctant to leave their perches. And when they did eventually fly off, they would just burn their wings and come plummeting down to earth again. As you can see, London Bridge was full of wooden houses, and as the fire took hold, they all collapsed inwards, blocking the road, so stopping people escaping from the north side, but also preventing help arriving from the south side. And to add insult to injury, on the bridge underneath the arch was a water wheel supplying water to the north side. And when that went, there goes your supply of fresh water and the water for the firefighting. So Samuel Pepys, he's got to tell the authorities, he's got to go to the king. But first, he does what every man would, buries his wine and his cheese in the garden for safekeeping. So he hotfoots it to the palace of Whitehall, to tell King Charles II about this fire in his own city. And there you can see Duke of York, which was the king's brother. So King Charles II commands Pepys to go back to the mayor and tell him to start demolishing houses. And he tells the Duke of York, his brother, to go and command operations in the city. So Pepys runs back to the mayor and he finds him in a complete state. When he gave him the message, the mayor said, "I am spent. People will not obey me. I have been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it." Oh dear. So this is what the city looked like by Sunday evening. You can see this is blue bit is the pudding lane, and the fire spread west. And the Duke of York, he put all command posts all around the city walls. There was a problem. Now, even though the fire started in the bakery of the Faryners, it was foreigners that were getting the blame, especially the French and the Dutch, because the British had been at war with both those countries very recently. So the Duke had to command his guards, the Royal Life Guards, to go and protect Frenchmen, Dutchmen. Even a Swedish guy was nearly lynched because they thought he was Dutch. So they had to protect the foreigners, round them up and put them somewhere safe. So this is the view from London Bridge. There was now panic on the streets of London, but the river wasn't looking too good either. It was full of barges and boats trying to get away from the fire, and other ones were trying to get to it to pick people up. At the time, river taxis became the lightermen. They became really, really expensive. And Samuel Pepys managed to get over to the other side of the river in one, and he watched the fire as it burnt from the south side, the safety of the south side, the Anchor pub he was in. And he said he saw an entire arch of fire going from one side to the other, much like the flames from the Blitz in 1940-41. So the king now set sail from Whitehall Palace to inspect the fire for himself. And when he gets to London Bridge, he sees that houses are still standing but burning. The mayor hadn't been demolishing any of them. And he's nowhere to be seen now, the mayor. So the king, he gets involved. He overrides the mayor's authority and starts pulling down houses. He even rolls up his sleeves and starts throwing buckets of water onto the fire. The fire now stretches to the commercial district. The Royal Exchange, that went up in flames, Thomas Gresham's Royal Exchange, as did the banks on Lombard Street. And John Evelyn, who was travelled from Deptford when he heard about the fire, he saw 4 different fires going from different directions, from Threadneedle Street and Cornhill, Walbrook and Bucklersbury, all converging on the same point, the east end of Eastcheap. Very wealthy area, Eastcheap. So there's trouble. The Queen Mother finds out and she's off. She leaves her house in Somerset House and sails for safety down at Hampton Court Palace. At the same time, at Westminster, they load boats up with money chests ready to move at a moment's notice. This is Newgate. The fire has got as far as Newgate on Monday. Guildhall, that burnt. It was made of such solid oak that when it burnt, it looked like a palace of gold or a building made of burnished brass. Newgate prison burnt, and they had to move the prisoners from Newgate somewhere secure. A lot of them had burned to death. Some of them escaped. And this is from a Dutch painting, by the way. A lot of the paintings you see are from Dutch artists. And you can see in the distance St. Paul's, old St. Paul's, still intact. So the next day, you've got this sort of scene. This is from Jower Wharf. You can see all the refugees are moving out. and you might just be able to see sparks that are coming away from the fire. And these sparks were going to the south side, to Southwark. They were starting fires over there. These were easily put out. But other sparks went from this side northwards, and they were starting fires independent from the main conflagration. This led people to believe that there was something afoot, like a conspiracy from foreign powers to burn the city to the ground, sabotage. The London Gazette put out its last edition on the Monday before its own offices were burnt down, and the void of information was now filled with rumour and speculation of a gunpowder plot. Now the fire is heading south and west on the north bank to the tallest building in the city, St Paul's, Old St Paul's. Now, people thought this was going to be safe, so they were moving all their goods from their own buildings to here. Also, the booksellers and the printers moved all their paper to here to keep it safe down in the crypt. But the problem with the building was that it was under repair. It was covered in scaffolding as part of Christopher Wren's running repairs on it. That's why it says, even the ruins perish. So now the masonry falls down into the crypt, sets light to all that paper, turns Old St Paul's into a blazing inferno. John Evelyn said that stones were flying like grenades from the building, and he said that lead was melting like snow from the roof and flowing away in a molten lead river that neither horse nor man would fear to tread in. Just to the west of Old St Paul's was Ludgate. This is another Dutch painting. Ludgate was probably painted by this artist because it was the artist's quarter. It's quite likely that he lived in this area. And if you look closely, you can see people running through the gate. There's also a woman down here with her baby in a cradle. Next to Ludgate was the River Fleet. The River Fleet, it'd be quite reasonable to think that that would be a fire break, but buildings collapsed into the river and allowing the flames to cross it. They're now heading down Fleet Street to the birthplace of Samuel Pepys, funnily enough. And on Fleet Street was the command post of the Duke of York with the Royal Lifeguards, and he was trying to stop the advance of the fire to the Palace of Whitehall. But as the flames jumped the river and head down Fleet Street, the Duke of York and all of his men had to make a run for it. Now there is some serious panic and consternation at the Palace of Whitehall. But what's going on in the east? Well, Samuel Pepys is now up All Hallows Tower. He's come back to the fire because he's a Navy administrator, don't forget. And not only is he worried about his house, which is in Seething Lane round about here, he's more worried about what's in the tower. The tower is an arsenal full of gunpowder, which the Navy store there. When that goes up, it's going to be like a nuclear bomb. It would take down the bridge and every single house within about 2 miles. So he calls for the Navy, and they arrive just in the nick of time. Sailors from Woolwich and Deptford Royal Dockyards bring barrels of gunpowder, and they put a barrel in each house in between the fire and the tower. With a very long fuse, they set light to it and destroy them. Bang! And cart away the debris, the one thing that checked the fire. And now they've stopped the fire in its tracks. It rejuvenates the population. They've been wandering around like zombies. They think it's some sort of punishment by God. And they finally think, the fire is defeatable. So they all start getting involved again. And by Wednesday afternoon, the fire has been checked. The flames are abating. But from the tower all the way to Temple Bar, and from the Thames to Bishopsgate, to Newgate, to Smithfield, all is utter, smouldering desolation.